Hello, I think we are finally ready to start. Welcome everyone. You're listening and this time seeing us as well to Fuel by Microbes, a podcast from the European research project Microbes for Biogas. Welcome to our first live panel discussion. My name is Joana Branco. I work at the science communications agency ScienceSeed, which is one of the partners of Microbes for Biogas. Our project is funded by the European Commission and is focused on optimizing biogas production. We'll be moderating our discussion today when we'll be talking about the role of biogas in a net zero future. On our first podcast episodes, we talked about the potential of biogas and how microbes can help us change the way we fuel our world. How biogas can be key in establishing circular economy and help us manage our waste while producing energy. Yet some questions came up that need answers. Biogas is not a fossil fuel, it's a renewable fuel, but we use it the same way we do natural gas. We burn it, so we are still in the end just burning gas. Won't this contribute to climate change? To answer this question, I am joined by three amazing guests who will help us shed light into the impact of biogas on the Earth's climate. So first we have Semra Bakkaloglu, currently a researcher at the Sustainable Gas Institute at the Imperial College in London. Welcome, Semra.
Hi, Joanna. Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Jerry Murphy, Director of the MaREI Research, Development and Innovation Center, supported by the Science Foundation Ireland. Welcome, Jerry.
Thank you for the invite. It's good to be here.
And finally, representing our project, the Microbes for Biogas Consortium, we have our coordinator, Manuel Porcar, leader of the Biotechnology and Synthetic Biology Lab at the I2 Bio Institute of the University of Valencia. Welcome, Manuel.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
To anyone following the live stream on YouTube, please send us your questions via chat, and we'll try to share as many questions as possible during the event with our speakers. And to our speakers, if you have any comments or questions regarding what anyone else is speaking about, please raise your hand. I'll give you the chance to express your thoughts. So without further ado, I'll start by asking our guests to introduce themselves briefly and explain their connections to today's topic. Starting with Semra. Please, Semra, could you tell us a bit about your background, how you got involved in biogas research?
Hi everyone. Currently, I have been working at Imperial College London. I'm doing my postdoctoral study in there, and my work involves around environmental sustainability. My research focusing on methane emissions, hydrogen, biomethane supply chain, negative emission life cycle assessments, and also energy system modeling. How I focused on this biomethane when I'm doing my PhD at Royal Holloway, University of London. I was responsible for the waste sources, the methane emissions from waste sources. I qualified and quantified the emissions, characterized and quantified the emissions from waste sources, because when we say waste, we consider landfill, wastewater treatment plant, and the biogas is also part of it. When we are treating our waste, we are diverting our mainly the food waste, biodegradable waste to anaerobic digesters. And I did the mobile studies, mobile measurements across the real sites. Yeah, that's how I ended up with the methane emissions.
Thank you, Semra. Jerry, you are a world-leading expert on biofuels. Could you please give us a bit detail about your expertise?
I'm a civil engineer and I did a master's in anaerobic digestion in 1992. So it's 31 years ago. I built an upflow anaerobic sludge blanket and I put it into a wastewater treatment plant and I managed it and operated it. And then I worked in industry in the area of waste management. So I would have designed wastewater treatment plants and biogas plants and industrial wastewater. And then I liked academia, so I went back to do a PhD in my mid-30s and got a PhD in sort of circular economy, energy, environmental systems. So biogas was a part of it, as well as gasification and other areas. And at this stage, I've published over 200 peer-reviewed journal papers on really bioeconomy, biomethane, systems, And I would see, to me, an anaerobic digester is not like a wind turbine. It fits into many, many things. So, we published on biorefineries, on seaweed and bioeconomy. And I would see anaerobic digestion as an element within something else. At the moment, I'm the director of a center, and we've graduated 200 PhDs in this sort of area. So it's what I've been doing for 30 years, is how biomethane fits into other systems. And I think that's important. It's not you build a digester, there are things there and you try to make them better than they are. So our most recent project is working on a distillery, and they're now spending 50 million on decarbonizing the distillery, but that involves digestion of stillage and byproducts. So we've worked with them on decarbonization pathways. So I suppose that's where I'm at. It's how does anaerobic digestion fit into a system? And no two digesters are the same. So you can't say this is an anaerobic digester. It could be in a distillery, it could be on a wastewater treatment site, it could be a food waste digester, or it could be a maize digester sitting in the middle of hundreds of thousands of hectares of maize, which I don't think is the most sustainable model.
Thank you, Jerry. How about you, Manuel? Coming from a synthetic biology background, tell us a bit about your connection with today's topic.
Well, thank you, Joanna. So I'm a biologist by training. I study biology here in Valencia. And then during my PhD, I specialized in applied microbiology. I work with Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a microorganism with which transgenic plants are made, and it's used in biocontrol. And then I have been working in the Pasteur Institute for like 4 years in bacteriology and in virology. And then I went back to Spain through the program called Ramón y Cajal, which is a well-known one here that allows people being abroad to come back to Spain. And then established my own research group on biotechnology and synthetic biology in the University of Valencia. And I have currently this dual background. So I have this academic background in which I lead the lab of biotechnology and synthetic biology, and I coordinate micro for biogas from there. But then 6 years ago, I co-founded Darwin Bioprospecting Excellence, which is a company that is focused on applied microbiology with a clear connection to the industry. And in both cases, what we do is we are bacterial hunters. So we like to explore the microbial diversity of the world. We have a lot of publications in very different topics to biogas. So we're interested in extremophiles living in deserts, in microorganisms that live in zona, in the coffee machines, in microorganisms that are present in the water that degrade plastic. So the list is very long. And then I got interested in biogas, and it was, well, it's a combination of things. So I directed the thesis of one member of Micro for Biogas, Christian Abendroth, and he had a large interest in that, and I was interested. So for me, it's a particular case of the potentiality of microorganisms, the biogas production. So I'm very glad to be here, but of course my approach is very narrow, I would say, or at least it's very focused on microorganisms themselves. And I think that the topic of biogas it's amazing because you can see it from very different ways, perspectives. So one, of course, is the microbial one. There is the engineering one, there is the management one, there is the ecological one, there is the climatic one. So I think we're going to have a very nice discussion here.
Thank you so much, Manuel. I agree. I think your different backgrounds are going to be very nice to communicate all the information. So let's move on to today's topic. The impact of biogas on climate change, on a possible net zero future. So when talking about the impacts of biogas, there is a concept that is mentioned pretty much everywhere: carbon neutrality. I'd like us to start by clarifying this concept and understanding what exactly does this mean. So Manuel, could you provide some insight into this?
I can provide an insight from a microbiological perspective, but maybe I'm wrong. So I would be glad to see the comments of my collaborators here. So first thing that we have to say that, of course, we are living in a climate emergency. So there is a greenhouse effect that contributes enormously to the changes in temperature, basically, and other effects in our planet. So this change is made basically by some gases, and the most famous one is CO2. So what is carbon neutrality? So carbon neutrality is the, let's say, state or the goal in which, from a global perspective, from a planetary perspective, the emissions of CO2 would be compensated by the sequestration of CO2. So this balance is a delicate equilibrium, and of course there is the human part of it, which is basically by burning fossil fuels. Although for the audience here to know, CO2 is produced normally in all the biomes on Earth. So we humans produce CO2, animals produce CO2, the forests, the oceans produce CO2, and there are also places in which CO2 is kept. So forest again, the oceans, lagoons, etc. But when it comes to carbon neutrality, it refers, as I mentioned, to this equilibrium in which the amount of CO2 artificially released to the atmosphere is balanced by a similar or equal intake in the planet through sequestration strategies. That would be my humble microbiological perspective to carbon neutrality. I don't know if my colleagues can make some comments on that.
Don't think they want to. So from what I gathered, there's no, it's a concept that there is no net increase of CO2. So Semra, I wanted to ask, how does this concept apply to biogas?
Let's start with what is the biogas. I'm pretty sure our audience know what is biogas means, but I'm going to use the biomethane term. It might be confusing what I am saying. The biogas is produced by the biodegradable materials. Biodegradable materials by the microbes, the microorganisms just consume under anaerobic condition, and they produce the gas, which is methane and carbon dioxide. And this biogas includes, let's say, 50-70% of methane, 50-30% of carbon dioxide, and other impurities such as H2S. When you upgrade this biogas to biomethane, upgrading means that remove the impurities and the carbon dioxide. It could be the membrane pressure sweep absorption or the chemical water stripping, the scrubbers that you remove this carbon dioxide and H2S, and you obtain the biomethane, which has 97-98% of methane in the gas. And it's also similar to natural gas that you can use in your daily life. It's similar to natural gas. And when we come at the beginning where we got these sources, we got it from these biodegradables. It could be the agricultural, maize, your food waste, manure, or the grass. When the organisms, the biomass is building up, they capture the carbon dioxide from air, they fix in their biomass, and when we use this biomass through the process, we have the same carbon captured from the atmosphere, for example, in the grass, and then you turn the grass into biogas and biomethane. That's how this carbon is cycling. And when we say the carbon neutral, what we're capturing, it should be the same at the end of it. What we're emitting, it's all the same. For the carbon dioxide perspective, we fix the carbon dioxide from air into body, and when we are burning or combusting this biogas or turn to the biomethane, you have the carbon dioxide emitting. But the tricky part is methane, because you are changing the methane as well, you are producing the methane as well. But at the end, we have the same carbon in the biomass and then turn to the biogas and then emit it. If you are emitting the carbon dioxide, the same carbon dioxide is cycling.
Okay, thank you very much for explanation. I think the next round of questions I have here has a lot to do with what you were explaining. I'd like to get a little bit more into the greenhouse gas emission situation. So biogas is methane and CO2. We have heard countless times about the dangers of greenhouse gases for the climate. So I think it is rather counterintuitive to think that producing more greenhouse gases is a good idea to fight climate change. Manuel, how can we justify producing biogas in the light of actual climate change?
Well, I have to say that I like very much this question, because it may seem very obvious, but I think that a lot of people think that, and it's very nice to have the opportunity to discuss it. So first, both CO2 and methane are natural gases, but it is true that in the current situation, we humans are producing a lot of them. Both of them contribute to global warming, but the rate to which they contribute to the greenhouse effect is very, very different. So it's like 25 times more potent the effect of methane compared to CO2. This means that to set it in a very simplified way, if we have some kind of subproducts that or agricultural products or debris of any kind that are going to be left on their, let's say, natural state, and they are going to produce methane, which is going to be released into the atmosphere, this is going to be to have a significant effect in global warming. But if instead we take this, we put it under control conditions, we produce biogas, which, as Semra was mentioning, is a mixture of CO2 and methane. But what the interesting part from the energetic point of view is methane. And we burn this methane to make energy. It is true, and many people will say, but you are burning it, you are emitting CO2. It is true. But it's a kind of transformation in which you are taking methane, you are avoiding this methane to be released into the atmosphere. And when you are burning it, you are releasing CO2. Which is indeed a greenhouse gas, but is 25 times less active than methane. So if you make the numbers, theoretically speaking, you are contributing to a better management of the greenhouse effect.
Okay, but we still have emissions of CO2, so let's go into that. There is no net increase in carbon, as Semra explained before. If we burn biogas, it's a closed cycle, but we do have a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere already. So, Jerry, is there any way we can avoid these emissions from burning biogas?
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention at the start, I led the International Energy Agency Biogas Task for 6 years, and we produced lots of reports. They're available online. And in that time, I edited maybe 17 reports on these types of questions. And I suppose what net zero is really difficult. I mean, it's really, really difficult. And if you consider that we cover the world in PV and wind turbines, and all our electricity comes from a turbine, we're still going to have cattle in the field belching methane, and methane has a global warming potential of 25. We're going to have open slurry tanks. And the work that we've done in the IEA, for example, we looked at maybe 200 anaerobic digesters, and we looked at the slippage. So we put infrared over the digesters. We found where the leaks were. We put little cylinders over. We calibrated. We found the major sources of leakage. And the major source of leakage is pressure release valves. So biogas is stored in a balloon. If it's cool at nighttime, and on a summer day in Austria, it hits 35 degrees, the bag expands, and a pressure release valve opens, and out goes your methane. So we've looked at lots of biogas plants, and we found that some of them were slipping maybe 10, 15% methane, which is not good. But some were very, very good, and they were down to maybe 2% slippage. So within the Renewable Energy Directive, there is a criteria that you have to measure and manage, and you have to show on a whole life cycle basis that you're reducing the greenhouse gas by up to 65% for the fossil fuel comparator for transport and 80% for electricity. So what's really important is if we look at slurry, you know, we have lots of slurry tanks across the planet. They emit about 17% of their potential. So methane is going to the atmosphere at a global warming potential of 25. If you can cover that tank, and if your biogas plant is only emitting 2%, so a really good biogas plant, really well monitored, matching the Renewable Energy Directive, you've saved 13% methane. So that's 13 by a global warming potential of 25. And if that biomethane then goes into a long distance truck like they have in Linköping in Sweden, that truck emits CO2, which is 25 times less global warming potential than the methane that came out of the slurry tank. And this is true of sewage treatment plants and waste treatment plants. We have lots of organic feedstocks that will produce methane. So an argument we would make is that if we electrified everything, electrified cars, all our electricity came from turbines or PV, you're still going to have methane coming from open slurry tanks, from sewage treatment plants. So in a circular economy system, it's a very good idea to capture that methane, put it into a bus, and that bus can travel maybe 1,000 kilometers, a coach or a lorry. So up in Linköping in Sweden, they have a food waste digester and a slaughter waste digester. These are products that have no other value, and they do cause contamination. So they convert it into methane for long distance transport. And a battery won't take a truck 1,000 kilometers. But what they also do, which is really important, is they produce a biofertilizer. And if you think of fertilizer, we produce 150 million tons of ammonia every year from natural gas. So NH3, which is ammonia, the H comes from natural gas. We put it on the land. So we're putting fossil fuel on the land to get our food. And if we don't put fossil fuel on the land to get our food, our yield goes down by a factor of 7. So if you want to feed the planet, you need fertilizer. But what the biogas plant does is the digestate can replace a lot of that fertilizer. So your biogas plant is preventing fugitive methane emissions. It's producing a fertilizer. And what they're also doing now is that carbon dioxide, when you talk about biomethane, so the pure methane goes into the truck, the CO2 is left behind, that is a product. I mean, Denmark uses 65,000 tons a year of CO2 in hospitals, in laboratories, for packing milk, for packing meat. In my laboratory, I buy CO2 all the time. So CO2 in Denmark, 65,000 tons per annum is needed. It's needed in carbonated drink. So you now have a number of products. You have a transport fuel, you've CO2, you have a biofertilizer, you've prevented contamination of watercourses from slurry, you've reduced fugitive methane emissions. So when you look at a biogas plant in the whole, it's very simplistic to just say CO2, because we will always have, even worse than CO2, we will have methane. So to me, a biogas plant is there to get rid of fugitive methane emissions, to improve the environment, to make a sustainable transport fuel that cannot be done by electricity, long distance trucks, ships. In Linköping, they liquefy the biomethane, so it's a liquid fuel from slaughter waste, running trucks 1,000 kilometers. So I would say it's complex.
Okay, thank you very much. You mentioned somewhere of the leakage situation, so that's awesome because that's right the topic I want to talk about now. Semra, a year ago, you published a very interesting study that got a lot of media attention. Can you give us an outlook of what you discovered?
Yeah, I'll give a brief explanation. As Jerry mentioned, there's a lot of study in the literature. They did the real case methane measurements from biomethane and biogas sites. I did also the mobile analysis. What I'm saying mobile analysis, we have the spectrometer in our car, and the spectrometer takes the air from the top of the car, and we're running on the public road, just cross the wind that get the plume, and then measure directly the air how much methane, carbon dioxide, and water vapor in the gas simultaneously when we are traveling around. And in the literature, there's lots of studies, mainly from Europe, also Canada, from US as well. They are reporting the methane emissions from the biogas supply chains, or the outside of it, or the inside of each stage. What I'm saying in inside, some studies reporting the methane emissions from feedstock storage. Some of them just reporting the emissions from anaerobic digesters. Some of them the upgrading unit and the digestate storage. And when we come together, there's up until my study, we don't see what is the whole situation, what is the whole picture for this each stage of supply chain, starting from feedstock, anaerobic digestion to produce biogas, and then send it to upgrading unit to produce biomethane, and then transportation, storage, distribution. And also we had the digestate, that you have the byproduct from anaerobic digester that you can use for fertilizer, as Jerry explained. And when we come together, there's a different mobile studies. In my paper, I break them together. I collect all the available literature data from the mobile studies from each stage of emissions and use the statistical methods, Monte Carlo simulation. First of all, I just try to understand what is the characteristics of each stage of emissions, and then in order to sum them up, I use the Monte Carlo simulation for 10,000 to run to get the cumulative distribution of those emissions. And what we see, this emission range is higher than what we first thought. And we know we don't have the whole situation. We have different studies. They did also the whole site measurements from outside of the facility, as I did in my PhD. But as Jerry mentioned, some facilities is very well equipment. They invested a lot, they emit less. Some of the facilities, mainly I can say the small farm-based anaerobic digesters, they don't have that much investment and they emitted more. I just bring them all the studies, and then when we get the cumulative distribution of those emissions, we see that the emissions is around 3.5 to 343 gram carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule high heating value. But it makes you sense when I change the unit as how much methane is released compared to how much you produced. It is less emissions is coming from biomass supply chain when we consider the production rate. But if you consider how much you're producing, how much you're emitting, we're much more emitting in the biomethane biogas supply chain. The emission range is around the 95% of emissions is up to 13%. We can say 12.7, similar to Jerry mentioned, up until the 20 is highest, the total supply chain emissions. The mean is around 6, the median is around 5% of total produced gas can be emitted. But it could be as low as 1.7 to 2%, because the 5% of total emission distribution is in this range, as Jay mentioned. It's nice that our result is also correlated with his experience, and we can say that if we converted this production rate emissions into the how much are we producing, we know from the International Energy Agency, and then I converted, and we can say that the emissions is around 6.5 to 7.8 megaton in 95%. In the mean emissions is around 2.8 teragram, so that's a megaton. And if you look at what is the highest emission, it could be 18.5 megaton, which is up to 2 times higher than the International Energy Agency estimate. But I would like to highlight what they are reporting. They are reporting the production and use of fuels based on the emission factors. Our study based on the mobile emissions. That's why it's different. And the most important thing is the super emitters that you can't capture with the emission factors. What I am saying with super emitters, some equipments in the biomethane supply chain or biomethane and biogas supply chain, they emit disproportionately methane, and they are not continuous emitted. They just emitted, or they emitted a couple of days or just a couple of minutes, and when the operator saw see these big peaks, they just fixed it and reduced those emissions. But these high emitters are responsible, the 5% of high emissions are responsible for the 62% of total emissions. What means for us, if we just monitor our emissions regularly and we can see these high peaks, if we fix them, we can reduce our emissions. I can give one nice example. When I was doing my PhD, we are traveling around the biogas facilities in the UK, and we visited one facility which is quite big. They're producing biomethane, and we see the peaks. And then I contact with the company. They are welcome us to come to the facility. We visited the facility. We chatted them, and they told us that they saw that there's a pressure relief valve at top of the one unit emit disproportionately methane, and the operators, when they are visiting site, the operators realize it and they fix it. At the second time that we were visiting, we didn't see that peak. They just fixed their emissions, and obviously their emission rate would go down. The important thing, the key message from my study is that when we are trying to decarbonize our system, we need to replace our fossil fuel with biomethane, because it is similar to natural gas. You can use for the vehicle fuels, heat, electricity purpose. If you take an urgent attention for the biomethane supply chain emission, we can get much more benefits, because it's cheaper. You have to treat your waste, you have to use anaerobic digesters, you already have your biomethane. If you reduce those emissions by regularly checking, where's my emission coming from, which instrument, the pressure relief valve, reduce the venting events or flaring, and then continuously monitoring, repairing those units, and automation and educated operators, we can manage to reduce our emissions and we can get much more benefits. And I would like to highlight that we need urgent attention for the methane emission from biomethane supply chain as well. And with this proper detection, measurement, and repair technique, the emissions can be avoided. Biomethane is an important renewable source, but it has potential to be even better. Yeah.
Just one clarification, I might not have understood correctly, Semra, because you talked about industrial scale operations.
Mm-hmm.
In those operations, you can detect, like what you were describing, suddenly a huge leakage problem, which is evolved, and you change that and it's fixed. But what about smaller reactors? I mean, is this this leakage situation, is it comparable what happens in big industrial reactors with the smaller ones that work, for example, in a farm? Is it a similar problem that we have to deal with? Is it totally different? Can you please clarify that?
Yeah, I think Jerry has also some points to add. I can say that in my previous paper, what we realized that the small facilities for the agricultural small one, they generally produce the biogas. They have less investment and they emitted more, and the operators are not well educated like the big facilities. Because if you are producing biomethane, if you are injecting your gas to natural gas grid, which is already infrastructure is already there, they are more careful their emissions. They are regularly monitoring. But when it comes to the small farm base, they emitting more. Their instrument is not well isolated, or they don't realize that there's a pressure relief valves open to the atmosphere and they're releasing high methane. And the similar result is also I saw in the Danish studies. They also mention about that small facilities emit more than the large facilities. This is we can say that we can see that there, if you have the investment, automation, well equipment, and well-educated operators, you can reduce your emissions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So after all this we've been talking about, what Semra just explained, Jerry, is it possible then that the process of biogas production itself can unintentionally release more methane than what is ultimately captured and used?
It's interesting. I was at a conference and a Danish colleague who'd surveyed industrial biogas plants and farm scale biogas plants found there was less leakage at the farm plants. And the reason he gave is that you're at an industry and you're working 5 days a week, and typically you go home on Saturday and Sunday, where the smaller scale plants had farmers who were there on Saturday and Sunday and tended to go out at night time and play with the engine and see how it was working. So he found that some of the small scale digesters ran by farmers were managed better because there was 24 hours, 7 day a week management. I suppose one of the things that's important going forward is the Renewable Energy Directive will require all biogas plants to do a full life cycle analysis and to examine every process. It will be an accountancy process. And if you're leaking methane, you're leaking money because your end product is money. So there is a perspective that we may have had, digesters that were not run well and they were sitting in the background and it was renewable, but it will now have to be certified. And if you want to trade biomethane, there'll be a green gas certification, and you will be told that you're slipping 4% of your methane, and this is your gram CO2 per megajoule of that biomethane. So within Europe, it will be very heavily regulated. But things that are happening that to me are quite seismic is the CO2. So there's a concept of BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. And if you're making biomethane, where methane is your product, you have a neat concentrated form of CO2. If you were to sequester that in the ground, you are now a negative emission technology, because you had methane from an open slurry tank that was going to the atmosphere, you stopped that happening, or you had a crop that sucked in CO2 and the CO2 goes into the biogas, but you're now putting it underground. So you're far, far better. There's a sequestration process. So anaerobic digestion lends itself very, very, very well to BECCS. So that brings your greenhouse gas into a negative area. Another thing that we're working on is that we have a project where we grow microalgae off the CO2. So we have a carbonate bicarbonate tower, or biogas goes into the tower, microalgae go into the tower, microalgae take out the CO2, and the methane in this case is going to tractors. But you now have microalgae, and microalgae are a superfood. So every morning my wife makes microalgae smoothies for the family. It's a superfood full of nutrients and has a very high economic value. So if you apply a life cycle analysis and you allocate by value, the CO2 footprint goes with the microalgae, which is going to be far, far less than meat or far, far less than milk. So you're getting a very low carbon footprint food with a very high economic value. I mean, if you consider buying 40 milligrams of microalgae at €4, that's 10,000 euros a ton. So the economics of your biogas plant for the developer are, I've got this super product, microalgae, it's making me lots of money. I've got biomethane going into my tractors, so I'm decarbonizing my tractor. I've got fertilizer going on my field, so I don't have to buy synthetic fertilizer. And all of a sudden, the gram CO2 per megajoule for the biomethane can be very, very low because we're taking the carbon footprint with the microalgae. So there are many, many ways of devising a system that your biomethane has a low greenhouse gas footprint because you're into this poly system where you've got food, you've got CO2, you've biofertilizer, and you've got, in the case of rural agriculture, you've got the fuel for your tractor. So you've got a localized system, you've got biotechnology at a farm scale, and it's far more profitable. One other area, if I may, which is very interesting from my perspective, is the area of methanol. And if you look at methanol, CH3OH, I don't want to be too complicated, but methanol is methane with an extra oxygen molecule, and we can make methanol. And methanol is a very, very valuable product. It's a precursor to formaldehyde. The world produces 110 million tons of methanol. But what I think is interesting is Maersk. Maersk have 19 methanol ships that they have built, and methanol is going to be the decarbonized fuel of shipping. But there is no methanol available. So what did they do? They went to Denmark, and we reformed biomethane from biogas into methanol. And Maersk is now using methanol that came from biogas, that came from a digester in Denmark. So again, it's not just methane. We can make methanol. And methanol can be used for very high value products, formaldehyde, and the market at the moment is 110 million tons, but it will also power shipping. So again, I would say there is huge flexibility in a system. And I've attended over my 30 odd years events where people say biogas is unsustainable. I mean, you have to look at the system. Are you making shipping fuel? Are you making superfood for microalgae? Are you making biofertilizer? But when you look at biogas in its particular system, it can be really, really good. But you can also find an example of a really sloppy digester run by someone who doesn't care less, and it's really, really bad. So biogas is neither good or bad. It fits into a system. And if that system is well managed, you can have fabulous products, and it can be really, really sustainable. And I do think the challenge for us as a planet going forward is, fertilizer. 150 million tons of fertilizer is produced every year from natural gas. 110 million tons of methanol is produced every year from natural gas. So natural gas is an ingredient. And if we don't have that renewable hydrogen molecule, we still have natural gas making fertilizer, making methanol, making plastics, and biogas can replace natural gas. So biogas can make ammonia, biogas can make methanol. So it's got a huge flexibility, and it's something that I think the mindset needs to get to. A biogas isn't just, we got maize from Germany, we covered Germany in maize, we put it into a biogas plant, and we're slipping 10% methane, so it's bad. Like biogas is far more and far better than monodigestion of maize in Germany. It's a very, very variable, flexible system that has many uses.
Thank you. I could ask many questions now, but I will leave it later, and I will get back to this very thorough answer because I don't want to mix the topics. But I do want to comment something. When you were describing that ideal circle of I have the algae, I have the biogas, I have the fertilizer, I have my agricultural, and everything sounds absolutely marvelous. My question is, and maybe Manuel wants to weigh in as well on this. I mean, that sounds very nice, but from what I know and understand, biogas production is not that reliable yet. It's not a process that we control at 100%. There are a lot of inefficiencies with biogas production. So how do we, how do we mix that vision of yours of that circle that works perfectly with the reality that there's a lot to improve in biogas production?
Okay, since I think that we are a little bit running out of time, we could be talking like hours about that because we have Micro for Biogas. The project itself is about this. So indeed, biogas production is an engineering process, but it has a biological core. And very often it's treated by engineers as a black box. So you put the debris, the subproducts there, the right temperature, and it produces biogas. And then you ask them, how much biogas are you producing? It depends. What did you mean it depends? It's like going to a factory that is making cars and asking the guy, how many cars do you produce? It depends. Some days 10, some days 35, depends on the weather. So the complexity, the microbial complexity, and it's not the only complexity, I'm aware, but it's my focus, of course. The microbial complexity, the diversity of the microbiomes of different factors, the diversity of composition, and the interactions between the microbiomes, the type of substrate which is being fermented, etc., makes that in practical terms you can have a wide range of yields. So this goes in line with what it was being said by my colleagues before, that there is a lot of room for improvement. So biogas is easy to produce. Anyone can make biogas with just some sheet, and a bottle, and it will produce biogas, but how much? How much? So to doing well, to maximize the speed of the process, the robustness of the process, the amount of the product, and the quality of the product, quality in this case is the rate between methane and CO2. A lot of things have to be improved in any part of the process, but in our specialty particularly, by selecting the best microorganisms and by having a very good detailed and on-time knowledge of which microorganisms are the key players in your factory.
Thank you, Manuel. So going back to what we were talking before, because we need to get to net zero, and Manuel, as Manuel was saying, we are not yet running out of time. We are okay, but let's move forward. But I do want you to ask this question as well, Manuel, if you are already talking. I'm still a bit confused. There's a lot of confusing data when people are trying to push forward biogas and defend how good this is as a renewable fuel. And I have this data here, then I would like to know, maybe, of course, the other speakers can weigh in this as well. So the World Biogas Association states that biogas can reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 18 to 20%, which sounds like a lot. So I would like to understand, and I think a lot of people in our audience would like to understand this as well. Where does these figures come from? Where are the data that support this? Because I've searched for it and I couldn't find it. So I would really like to understand, how can we say such a thing?
So I don't have the numbers, but I get the philosophy. So the philosophy is that by using biogas instead of fossil fuel, and if you manage it correctly, you are clearly decreasing the net emissions of greenhouse gases. So it's a relatively easy calculation made with the amount of waste and other subproducts that are present in a given continent, for example, Europe, and how much biogas energy you can get from that compared to the respective amount of energy that you would get with traditional, for example, fossil fuel sources. That's the calculation.
Do you agree with this, Jerry?
There is a Repower has a target of 35 billion cubic meters of biomethane by 2030. And that's a tenfold increase on existing biogas in Europe. I mean, if you look at Europe, we have over 17,000 anaerobic digesters already. And if we're going to have a tenfold increase, that's roughly 170,000 anaerobic digesters. So I suppose they're very much looking at scale. And one of the things, like, we have been looking at where does this come from? And in my own work in Ireland, you know, we've been working with a local distillery. It's a very large distillery. And we looked at how they could decarbonize through electrification where they could. But the only way they could get over 60% decarbonization was through digesting their byproducts. And the calculation, again, would include for the fertilizer going on the grain, which makes the whiskey, that's a Scope 3 emission. The biogas replacing natural gas, that's a Scope 1 emission. So when we looked at the whole life cycle analysis, we could achieve 100% greenhouse gas reduction by having electrification, but we had to have biogas. And if I look at Ireland, where I'm from, I mean, we produce 12% of the world's infant formula. So we're evaporating water off milk. We've lots of cheese. We've lots of alcohol. None of those are digested. So, I mean, if you're looking at going into industry like the cheese industry, the abattoir industry, the milk industry, and take all those feedstocks, it is a sizable quantification. And if I may, Denmark is now at 39% substitution of natural gas, and they have no energy crops. So in Denmark, all slurry has to be digested. So everything that is wet and organic and produces methane goes into a digester, and they're at 39% substitution of natural gas. So I haven't read the study, but I can imagine how they could come up with those numbers. One thing I would like to say about, I had one of my PhD students did her viva last Friday, Shui Ling, and what she looked at was three things. We looked at having two digesters rather than one. And the first digester produced volatile fatty acids at a low pH, and the second produces methane at a high pH. We also added biochar, and that led to direct interspecies electron transfer. So it makes the process happen faster. And then we stuck in little electrodes, and at the cathode, we pass through a current, and the CO2 is converted to methane. But her thesis showed we could double the methane production from existing feedstocks by those three steps. So if you're looking at 35 billion cubic meters of biomethane in Europe, we could halve the feedstock by applying technology and microbial enhancements and adding electric currents and adding little nanochar, nanomaterial, which is sort of an electron bridge, so it makes it happen faster. So I would say the world of biotechnology, the world of microbes, engineering, all working together, we can make a far better anaerobic digester. But in the climate action plan of Europe and of Ireland, anaerobic digestion is there. And I would say we're not meeting our climate action plan. So if you take anaerobic digestion out as something that's unsustainable, we haven't a hope of meeting our climate action plan. So I would say we need all the technologies, and biomethane is an essential element, in particular for wet organic materials, byproducts of distilleries, of creameries, food waste from cities. It is essential if we are to cut our emissions in Europe and in the world.
Thank you, Jerry. So we have I have a few questions from our audience, but I'll leave them to the end. Actually, I do have one that talks about biochar that you just mentioned, Jerry. But I think there's an essential topic. It's actually in the title of our event, so we do need to talk about that. That's the net zero future. It's another concept that's used a lot when we talk about biogas. Sometimes I even found carbon neutrality and net zero future used as synonyms many times, although they have the differences. So first I would ask Manuel. Manuel, can you explain to us, please, what exactly is a net zero economy?
Well, first, you're totally right that in most of the cases, even by scientists and policymakers, they use these terms exchangeably. Mm-hmm. But to be more precise, as we mentioned at the beginning of this roundtable, carbon neutrality refers to the equilibrium between the carbon which is emitted versus the carbon which is sink. And net zero would be a similar thing, but considering the totality of greenhouse gases. So this includes, of course, CO2, but also methane, of course. So it's a similar concept, but it's not exactly the same.
Thank you very much. I was looking. Yeah, we still have time for another one. Jerry, you mentioned something that I think it might be connected with this concept as well, and I would like to clarify that. You mentioned a couple of times during our conversation that biogas can have a negative carbon footprint. Can you clarify exactly what this means and what this entails?
If I paint a picture of an idealized system, if you treat slurry that was producing methane, and now you've captured that slurry and it's not producing methane, you have saved a significant quantity of emissions. If you put that biogas into a bus that travels 1,000 kilometers, you've decarbonized the bus that wouldn't work on a battery. If the digestate replaces fertilizer, which is natural gas, you're saving natural gas that's used to make ammonia, NH3. And if that CO2 is sequestered underground and stored forevermore, you're also storing that carbon underground, which is a negative emission technology. And that's how you come to a negative emission system. But that does demand an intelligent system. And what we do as well with the digestate, we can pyrolyze that to biochar, which is almost pure carbon. So if you have a very, very large biogas plant and there's too much fertilizer, you can pyrolyze it, and biochar is maybe 80–90% carbon. And if you put that on the land, it's like new soil, it's pure carbon. And biochar is a negative emission technology because it increases photosynthesis and pulls more CO2 out of the atmosphere. So the two elements which are negative emission is putting CO2 in the ground and making biochar from the digestate, which goes back on the land. So you can have a really bad system, or you can have a fantastic system. I mean, it's up to the designer.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to jump right into the questions before we wrap up. I have three different questions from our audience. So the first one comes from Zhongzhong Wang. And his primary concern, he says, is related to high latitude regions of Europe, such as Northern Europe. And in these regions, as we all know, severe winter temperatures imply that maintaining a digester is way more complicated, and it demands a considerable amount of heat, of energy. And these fluctuating temperatures can also obviously have an adverse effect on the productivity of biogas. So he's asking, are there any effective solutions or emerging biotechnology to address this issue? Manuel, can you give us a quick answer, please?
Well, I think Samsung is totally right, because methanogenesis is one process that is totally depending on the temperature. So even the natural methanogenesis is very, very dependent. At very low temperatures, no methane practically is emitted. And then you have like an exponential curve. And when you start rising the temperature, it produces more and more. And by the way, this is one of the concerns about the permafrost that will be maybe melting in the coming years. And then a lot of massive amounts of methane are going to be released. But in the case of the very Nordic or very cold places, of course, biogas production, it is not possible unless you make some adjustments. And the easiest adjustments is to heat. But you can reuse some of the energy. So very often in this part of the world, an important biomass is wood. And wood is often treated by steam explosion, which is a process that uses and releases heat. And you can recycle that heat in order to warm the substrate up. If you combine this with good insulation, and of course you have large volumes, then you have the conditions to work. We have colleagues in our project in Micro for Biogas that work under exactly these conditions, and they are getting pretty good results.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have another question here that asks, I'm not sure if I understand, when digestates being composted, there are some emissions from that activity. For example, emissions from ammoniacal nitrogen. Some studies propose using biochar. What do you think? A volunteer to answer this question? That it's not Manuel because he has already spoken, please.
I could try to answer. I mean, there is a digester in Northern Ireland that works off chicken litter, which is very high in nitrogen and is a monocle, but you can have a nitrogen stripper, you can take out some digestate, drop the pH. So there are technologies. Typically, the digestate can be stored in a bag, and this is some work that we've seen. So the digestate goes into like a big bag, and when the gas comes off, it's in the bag, and then that can be tapped. So the emission from the digestate can be captured and used in the same way as the biogas from the biogas plant. And again, there are many different options. As we mentioned, you can pyrolyze the digestate and convert it to pure char. So I would say we have technology solutions to specific problems, and we typically find in the design of an anaerobic digester, no two designs are the same. It's bespoke. It depends whether you're in Spain or in Greece or in Portugal or in India, but it's having intelligent design around the system to fit into the environment. One thing I would say as well, in the north of Europe, they have a lot of industrial ecosystems. So there could be an incinerator, and there's loads of spare heat. You put the digester next to the incinerator, and you take the heat from the incinerator, which is excess, and you manage the biogas plant. There are always solutions. I've seen probably 400 anaerobic digesters. I've seen them in Rwanda, in Brazil, in Iceland, in Sweden. They all work, but they're designed with local intelligence involved to make sure they work. I mean, there are probably 25,000 operating digesters everywhere on the planet. They work. They can be improved, but they work.
Thank you, Jerry. So now we are really close to running out of time, and I'd like to ask you all a final question, sort of a takeaway message for the people watching the event. So I'll give each one of you 30 seconds, so it's very brief answer. Please tell me, what part does biogas play in achieving a world net zero economy? Semra, you can start.
Okay, 30 seconds. For this, as I said before, as we told before, the biomethane is similar to natural gas. And as we move further into 21st century, we must move away from fossil fuels if we want to achieve the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And the biomethane is one of the key elements that you can also produce the hydrogen from biomethane, which also promising energy sources in the future when we decarbonize our system. This is also another way. And when we look at the circular economy, we have to treat our waste, and the anaerobic digester is way better than landfill and incinerator. And when we look at for the waste treatment, energy sources, as well as using the biofertilizer instead of the mineral fertilizer, we have much more advantages by using biomethane and biogas. Yeah.
Thank you. Manuel, your turn.
I would say that I see biogas like an important piece in a chess game against global warming. So it's not the only one. Of course, there are others. And I think that it's very important to have an overview of the process. They are not good energies and bad energies. They are just different, and we need to know them. And in the case of biogas, we have discussed here nicely, I think, the advantages of using biogas. There are some things that can be improved. And I think that this is the basis, to know it very well in order to improve it as much as possible, to contribute along the rest of the, let's say, pieces of this chess game for the goal, which is, of course, to reduce and mitigate as much as possible global warming.
Thank you. So last, Jerry.
I would think that biogas fits into a circular economy, energy and environment system. Greenhouse gas is a lot more than energy. I mean, we have all these ammonias, we've methanols, we've belching cattle, we've N2O, which is a global warming potential of 290 coming off the soil. So we have to look at biogas as a way of improving the environment, cleaning the environment, which also has a fuel, but it's part of a bigger system. And I would ask policymakers that when they think of biogas, don't think of biogas by itself. Think of it in terms of distillery, food waste management, wastewater systems. So biogas is part of many different systems. It's not a thing by itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So let's just finish our event by thanking all our speakers, Semra, Jerry, Manuel. Thank you for joining us today to discuss these topics. Thank you also to everyone who's been watching the live stream. The event recording will be shared on the Fueled by Microbes podcast profile on Twitter and on our YouTube account. You can also follow the podcast and you'll be informed of everything we are doing, but there are many more episodes to come. Thank you so much for your attention. I wish you all a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening.